back to Fox News Reporting. So far, you've met the young Charles Krauthammer, Harvard Medicine, class of 75. His life seemed to be going according to plan, but then no life ever really does. The snapshot was taken in May 1972. It shows a strapping 6'1" Charles Krauthammer standing on the beach. It's the confident smile of a young man well on his way to making it. Smart, athletic, handsome, driven. The future, all his.
That was spring break in my first year of medical school. I went with a bunch of friends to Bermuda. That actually is the last picture of me taken standing. Of course, I didn't know at the time. And I was coming out of the water carrying my sandals. I saw one of my friends with a camera. And then when I got to the top of the dune, I just stood there for a picture. Thought nothing of it until I discovered it years later lying around in a box. And remembering it, of course, it was a fateful picture.
Fateful because of what would happen back at Harvard that summer. You were 22 years old. Tell me about that day.
I went out. It was the end of my first year of medical school. We're doing neurology. We're studying the spinal cord, of all things. My classmate and I decided to skip the morning session. Beautiful July day. We play tennis instead.
After their game, they head back to class for the afternoon session. But along the way, they stop at a pool on campus, set down their books, and pull off their sneakers.
We're very sweaty. It's very hot. So we go for a swim. We take a few dives, and I hit my head on the bottom of the pool.
A freak accident, says Krauthammer.
The amazing thing is there was not even a cut on my head. It just hit at precisely the angle where all the force was transmitted to one spot, and that is the cervical vertebra, which severed the spinal cord.
When did you realize that the accident was life-altering?
The second it happened.
You knew?
I knew exactly what happened. I knew why I wasn't able to move, and I knew what that meant.
At the bottom of the pool,
I wasn't getting out. I knew, yeah.
He was paralyzed, unable to move his arms or legs. His friend thought he was clowning around and hesitated before diving down to save him. Was there ever a moment that you thought this is the end?
Well, when I knew what happened, and I knew I was at the bottom of the pool, and I knew I wouldn't be able to swim, I was sure that was the end.
Do you think back to that day often?
Not really. It doesn't. No, I kind of have a distance from it. I see it like as if it happened in a film. And interestingly enough, for people who talk about their near-death experiences, there was no panic. There was no great emotion. I didn't see a light. My life did not flash before me. You sort of get to a place where you're ready, and then you're suddenly brought back to the world.
So no cosmic revelation as he was rushed to the hospital, though Krauthammer notes the irony of what he left behind.
There were two books on the side of the pool when they picked up my effects. One was The Anatomy of the Spinal Cord, and the other one's Man's Fate by Andre Malraux. Quite a choice. I didn't know what was coming, but it fit very well.
Slide, Krauthammer was still not sure what to make of Reagan the man, who he met at the White House in 1986.
He invited me to lunch. I tried to engage him, like on the contras, what are you going to do? And all of a sudden, what I'm hearing from him is a story about how when he and Nancy were in the guest house of President Marcos of the Philippines, there was a giant spider on the ceiling. And the question was how to get him off without scaring Nancy. And I'm thinking, I don't get it. This is the most successful president in my lifetime. He seems to be out to lunch. What's going on?
He says it was only later that he realized what eluded him about Reagan.
He had no need ever to show how smart he was. He knew exactly what I was asking. He didn't want to talk about it. And if you thought he was a dunce, he didn't care because he knew that he wasn't.
It would also be some time before Krauthammer embraced a conservative domestic policy taxes, welfare, small government, and other Reagan-esque sins.
It took me about a decade. I was skeptical of tax cuts. I was skeptical of smaller government at the beginning. And then by the end of the 80s, I had begun to change.
What happened?
Empirical evidence. As a doctor, I'd been trained in empirical evidence. I mean, if the treatment is killing your patients, you stop the treatment. And I began to look and to read and to think about whether the view I had of a social democratic society like they had in Europe was the right way. And I sort of, I moved gradually to the idea of a more limited society, smaller government.
By that time, Krauthammer's world was really falling into place. In 1985, his son, Daniel, was born. 2 years later, Krauthammer won the biggest honor in print journalism, the Pulitzer Prize. Not bad for someone who started in the business less than a decade earlier, without even a writing sample. He went straight from the ceremony to see his father, who'd once worried about his son's jump from medicine to journalism. Shulam Krauthammer was 84 and gravely ill.
I went to the hospital where he was, and I said, Dad, I have something I want to give you. And I gave him the medal. And he beamed, and he showed it to all the nurses.
It turned out to be Krauthammer's final visit with his dad.
So the last time I saw him was a time when this whole circle was closed, and he could feel that the choice had been redeemed in some way. It was a very comforting thing to remember about the last time you see your parent.
Krauthammer called the 1990s a holiday from history. The Cold War was won. The era of big government declared over. And 9/11 brought a new urgency to his commentary.
People understand there is a nexus between these weapons, these states, and the terrorists, and we have to attack them where they are.
Krauthammer began appearing on Special Report's All-Star panel and was soon an audience favorite.
You've been a fixture on Special Report for a long time, and even still, a lot of people don't know that you're in a wheelchair. They don't know the extent of your paralysis.
I am sitting behind the table. And it is true. I'd say half the people I meet are absolutely surprised to see me in a wheelchair. And one of the more amusing of those incidents happened about 8-9 years ago. And I remember I was sitting in Madison Square Garden in the Fox box. I think it was a convention. And then Sean Hannity stands up and walks up the stairs. He looks at me and he goes, "What happened?" I just, I told him I was hurt as a medical student. It was no big deal. But it just told me that even somebody I'd been on the air with wouldn't know.
What is apparent is that Krauthammer has the attention of people in high places. Just one example, Krauthammer's opposition to White House counsel Harriet Miers not only helped block her nomination to the Supreme Court, a comment on the panel apparently gave President Bush a way out.
I remember thinking, how do they get out of this? And it came to me while on the set of Special Report.
I think what the administration ought to do is to say, look,
his face-saving solution basically went like this. Because Miers' legal writings were covered by executive privilege, the Senate couldn't vet her, so she had to withdraw.
And 3 days later, that's what they did.
Are you surprised by the amount of influence that you have with your column with Special Report, that you hear or see things that happen as a result of a column or a statement? Do you ever think about it?
Well, I think about it, and I find it worrisome. The reason is that when I was totally unknown, I could say anything I damn well pleased.
Coming up, power players and power hitters. From the All-Star panel to the ballpark in 8 minutes flat. Welcome back to Fox News Reporting. Charles Krauthammer set out to write a book about the things that matter most. And he didn't mean politics. The Palm on 19th Street, one of Washington's legendary power scenes. And you know you're lunching with one of D.C.'s power players if his caricature's on the wall.
I got one other scenario for you.
And today, Charles Krauthammer is holding forth on the nuances of power.
Oh, I can't wait to hear this. I know where this is going.
Not the political power of the White House 10 blocks away. He's talking about the Washington Nationals and whether they can power a late-season playoff run.
The Nats finished 14-2. One game ahead of Cincinnati.
Right.
And Worth is the MVP.
I was wondering where he was going. Harper, Tasman, but Worth.
I think Charles and I are both people who write about politics to support our baseball habits.
Noted conservative columnist and newly minted Fox News contributor George Will has written 2 books on baseball.
Do you remember when you first met Charles?
I think it's 1982 because he was then with the New Republic. A cover story on me. So I said, interesting guy, bring him to lunch, and that's how we met.
So how long did it take before you were friends?
I think it was instantaneous. 5 years later, I bought a new house, and the first thing I did was build a wheelchair ramp in the garage so Charles could get in.
You told us that when you get together, you first talk baseball. And then when you've dealt with all the important issues, you go to politics.
If there's time left over, yes.
Tim Kirchin, a senior writer for ESPN magazine, has lunch with Will and Krauthammer a couple of times a year to talk baseball.
To say they're fans is an understatement. To say they love the game is an understatement.
I grew up playing the game. I loved to play the game, and I was, as a kid, my brother and I would go around on our Schwinns on the streets of Long Island with transistor radios hanging from the handlebars, listening to Mel Allen and Phil Rizzuto doing the Yankee games. This was our lives.
Since the Nationals came to Washington in 2005, they've had no bigger fan than Charles Krauthammer.
When I started to do your show every night, you know, it ends at 7, the game starts at 7:10. The garage at Fox is 7 minutes if the wind is fair in the first 3 times from the garage at Nat Stadium. So I get there in the bottom of the first. I mean, how can I resist?
He makes that trip in a special vehicle designed just for him that lets Krauthammer accelerate and brake with his left hand and steer with his right.
Everybody who comes in here the first time is terrified. And I don't blame them. In fact, when I went for my driving test, the tester didn't want to get in. I told him he had to. It's the law. I think he passed me because he survived. He was so happy to be alive when it was over.
The first time I saw you go into the parking lot, you know, I waved to you, and then the next day you said to me, you really shouldn't wave. It's a little dangerous.
Yeah, the wave is a little bit hard. When somebody lets me in traffic, I'm tempted to take one hand and to say the thank you wave. But then, of course, I wouldn't have a hand on the steering wheel. So.
It actually took us 8 minutes to get to the stadium. When we took our seats, the Nats were beating the Braves 1-0. Krauthammer went into analyst mode right away, as though he was breaking down a procedural move Harry Reid might use to thwart a Ted Cruz filibuster.
On a 1-0 count, you want to steal on a breaking ball because it's slower. And is he likely to throw a breaking ball? No. So he's unlikely to try to steal right now. Strike 1. Now he might go for a breaking ball.
Turns out 9 innings with Charles Krauthammer is not just a day at the park. It's essentially grad school for baseball.
Okay. This is unfortunate matchup. The only reason Solano is in there, he's the backup catcher who doesn't hit very well.
For this, get through. Come on. No. Oh.
You could catch it. Can't run.
From time to time, Charles writes about baseball, typically in a way that transcends the sport. Take his column about Rick Ankiel, a 21-year-old pitching phenom who back in 2000 fell apart when he was picked to start a playoff game. With a huge national TV audience watching, he suddenly couldn't throw a strike. He never pitched the same again. But instead of quitting, Ankiel went back down to the minors, learned a new position, and returned to the majors as a hitter. The column is reprinted in Krauthammer's book, Things That Matter. It's in the personal section, just a few pages after the piece about his brother, Marcel.
I was thinking about this column. This is not really about you.
But then, your last line, the catastrophe that awaits everyone from a single false move, wrong turn, fatal encounter. Every life has such a moment. What distinguishes us is whether and how we ever come back.
That's why the Rick Ankiel story resonated so much with me. I mean, I had my fatal encounter, as did Rick Ankiel. There's an element of that in everybody's story, their low point. Do you want it enough, and are you lucky enough? That's a part of it, too.
While Krauthammer's injury has kept him off the playing fields and courts, he's pursued another competitive outlet, chess. Which lights you up more, baseball or chess when you're in the game?
There's no comparison. It's chess.
Do you still play chess?
No, I gave it up. It's an addiction.
Completely.
It's a poison. I mean, it's, you reach a point when you're on the internet, middle of the night, and you're playing speed chess, where you realize you're in a motel room and you're drinking Aqua Velva.
Your book was supposed to be a collection of essays on things other than politics, but it didn't turn out that way. Why?
In the end, everything, all the beautiful, elegant things in life, depend ultimately on getting politics right.
You say science, art, poetry, baseball must ultimately bow to politics.
I have a column in the book where I write about the Fermi paradox. Fermi was a great physicist who posed a simple question. We know that there are millions of habitable worlds out there. So there have to be thousands of civilizations. Why have we never heard from any of them? The most plausible explanation is that every time a civilization achieves consciousness and the kind of science that would allow you to transmit a signal, they destroy themselves. And the question is, can we regulate our politics in a way that will allow the human species to flourish and produce all the beautiful stuff? And that's a question that only can be answered by politics.
Coming up, battering the president and ticking off the Tea Party. Have you seen this mail?
My assistant reads most of my mail, and he's now in therapy.
Fox News reporting continues after the break. It was January 2009, 30 years after Charles Krauthammer began his journalism career here in Washington. A new president was about to be sworn in, but Krauthammer wasn't sure what to make of Barack Obama. He got the chance to size him up at a small dinner party hosted by his friend George Will. It was a week before Inauguration Day.
I remember before the president-elect arrived saying, I haven't been able to figure this guy out. Is he a centrist who will occasionally throw a bone to the left? Or is he a lefty who will occasionally throw a bone to the right? Nobody had any ideas.
Well, that was part of Mr. Obama's great strength. He was a national Rorschach test.
So we spent 3 hours with this new man. He leaves, and we're staying behind a little bit, and I say, same question. Is he a centrist? Is he a lefty? Nobody knew.
5 years later, you think you've figured him out?
I figured him out after that first State of the Union speech. 5 weeks later.
We will invest $15 billion a year to develop technologies like wind power and solar power. We can no longer afford to put health care reform on hold. It will be the goal of this administration to ensure.
I was so astonished that I wrote 5 columns in a row on what kind of unusual political animal he was in giving an agenda as radical as any since FDR. He basically said, I'm not here to tinker. I've come here to transform America.
You've been pretty tough on this administration, this president.
Well, I think he's done just about everything wrong.
But just as he was willing to offend his fellow liberals back in the 80s, he is equally willing to take on conservatives he believes are wrong. Have you seen this mail? From some of the things you've said about Ted Cruz? I mean, I get the emails.
Oh, I know you get the emails. I've seen the tweets. My assistant reads most of my mail, and he's now in therapy. Just kidding.
The Krauthammer on Fox did not appreciate what Cruz did.
If he listened to talk radio, it might really send his assistant over the edge.
Dr. Charles Krauthammer, in the 1980s, he was working for Walter Mondale.
There's a deep division among Republicans and a sense that they've been betrayed by leaders who are cowardly. I happen to think that that is a complete misreading of what's happened. It is 100% impossible to repeal something like Obamacare when you only control the House. I just think it's completely detached from reality. And when in the past I would encounter people detached from reality, well, first I'd give them a shot of Haldol, but that's not available to me right now. I know it's unpopular, but it's my job to call a folly a folly. If you're going to leave the medical profession because you think you have something to say, you're betraying your whole life if you don't say what you think, and you don't say it honestly and bluntly.
Do you think you'll ever stop writing?
No, I intend to die at my desk.
Really?
I would like to. I'm not sure I can arrange it.